that story is about a Sydney venue. It's called Divine Playhouse. It was a live venue that was opened up in what was a church up until the 1930s. That had since been kind of used as a community theatre. So it was a church until the 1930s. It was deconsecrated in 1932. It then went on to be used as a theatre in a community space, in the 7 or 8 decades that have followed. Recently, a grant was sought by Heaps Gay, which is a LGBTQIA plus community group based in Sydney who run events and venues and things like that. They were granted the lease, managed to secure the lease for this place, and then opened a venue called Divine Playhouse. It has been forced to close just 8 days after opening. It's located in Kent Street, Sydney. The building is heritage listed, was once a church, still, outwardly kind of looks like a church, and had been repurposed to become a club, event space, venue, name it, those kind of things there. Music was going to be happening there. A lot of things, a lot of creative endeavors were going to be happening there. It was called Unholy Playhouse, but they changed it last minute following concerns from the Christian community. So from the outset, there's definite plays on the fact that this building was at one point a church and still looks, like a church. Absolutely. It's in the name now, Divine, and it was going to be called Unholy Playhouse. But it launched on the 8th of July. It was intended to become a safe and inclusive space for the queer community. But following the venue's opening night, Christian groups held protests outside the building. They had prayer vigils. There were 70 people that attended a gathering and protested. There was calls for the withdrawal of a $100,000 Create New South Wales grant that was awarded to the project. There was calls for that to be rescinded. So it did generate some controversy. And as a result of that controversy, the landlord of that venue has basically pulled the operation of Heaps Gay temporarily and basically asked them to cease engaging in offensive trade.
Yeah, I'd really love to hear from people who might be a creative, who are also religious, who, but just because they're religious doesn't mean they have problems or connections to the LGBT community. Like, there are people who are a part of both communities, people who are, in the middle perhaps of both communities. I'd really love to know what you think of this situation as well, because it's certainly, as I said, the cease, engaging in offensive trade line, given its offensive nature, and, that was all in the letter from the landlord. I don't see from the outside the offensive trade or the offensive nature of what was happening inside that venue. As you said, perhaps the, Unholy Playhouse wording was perhaps a little bit on the nose. But as you said, it feels part of, maybe that was their way of paying ode to the venue as well. If they thought if we could make a pun out of it, if we could incorporate it into our new business, that's us sort of recognizing what was here whilst, pressing forward and sort of revigorating what is now on the inside. I don't know, but it certainly feels, again, I'm trying to be careful with my words, but I'll put it as perhaps an overreach in my side from what the landlord's statement was, the quote, preemptive action to cease trade, engaging in offensive trade, feels like an overreach, given from what I know. If I find, I won't do a federal government and completely backflip on what I've said publicly, but if I find evidence to the contrary, then perhaps my opinion will change. But certainly from the outside, just existing as an LGBT plus venue, putting on events, is not offensive and should not be shut down for those purposes.
No, and even I think even we should be free to comment on religion. We should be free to comment on anything, and that involves the freedom to make performance and art that probes and at times criticizes institutions and all types of things. And that's kind of what we see culture and art and humor doing regularly all the time to all different things, I don't think there should be exemptions. Obviously, it must be respectful and completely, like we have, standards of decency that most people are aware of. And that's why I said, had it been, a very recently operating church, yeah, maybe I can understand, give it a bit of time. But given the distance between when it operated as a religious building and what it has become now, I just struggle to see why that can't take place in there. And, as I said, nothing illegal was going on. There was no hate speech. There was nothing of that nature happening in there. There was no inciting of, violence or strong anti-religious sentiment. It was, performances and things like that drew on iconography and symbolism from religion, but, weren't seeking to destroy it. I think we need to make sure we have spaces where these things can happen. I mean, to be fair, a lot of people who are critical of it have said do it, but just don't do it in what was formerly a church, and that's their perspective. So there aren't people calling for, well, not huge amounts of people calling for this stuff to not happen at all. But, I understand it still resembles a church, but you could barely call it a church after it having not served as one for so long and having been used as other things in that time too. But yeah, again, that's just my view. So we would love to hear, as you said, Cam, perspectives from people across that spectrum. And ultimately, we'd love to see a resolution worked out with this venue so that Sydney can get another venue.
Yeah, and also just to push further, I suppose, on the point you made before, this is what art does, right? It asks questions. It can be provocative